Colonel Viktor Sokolov wasn't the kind of man who just wandered off. Not in Siberia. Not in temperatures that could kill a person in minutes. Not in the middle of a geopolitical standoff that hinged on every move he made. On January 14, 2023, the 7-year-old commander left Outpost Sever 1-2, one of Russia's most isolated border installations, and stepped into the pre-dawn darkness with a convoy scheduled to escort him to a classified briefing site. But the convoy never arrived. Somewhere along the 37-mile frozen stretch of wilderness, Viktor vanished. No distress call. No broken radio transmissions. No overturned vehicles or tire marks or blood in the snow. The road cameras showed nothing, not even a flicker of movement. It was as if the world swallowed him whole. Within hours, the Kremlin issued a terse internal memo labeling the incident a logistical error, the kind of phrase used when the truth isn't convenient. They ordered silence, no leaks, no press, no speculation. But the soldiers who served under Viktor weren't fooled. They spoke to one another in hushed tones, their voices dropping every time an officer walked by. They knew the terrain. They knew the dangers. They knew the odds of disappearing without leaving a single trace were close to zero. Viktor's wife, Elena, heard about the disappearance not from the Ministry of Defense, but from a panicked radio operator who broke protocol because he couldn't stand the thought of lying to her. She drove through the night to the outpost, arriving with frost clinging to her hair and a fury in her chest the officers weren't prepared for. "Where is my husband?" she demanded. They had no answer. They showed her forms to sign, statements to acknowledge, documents that read like pre-written excuses. She refused them all. Viktor had been preparing for reassignment. He had been healthy, focused, grounded. He was not the kind of man who snapped. He was the kind who followed orders and made others follow them too. The more Elena asked, the more resistance she met. Files were classified, footage restricted, theories dismissed. And yet, every soldier she spoke to had the same unsettled look in their eyes, as if they all knew something was wrong but were too afraid to name it. Something had happened out there, something impossible, something no one wanted to put into words. It took Elena 2 full days of relentless pressure threats, pleas, and refusing to leave the outpost commander's office before anyone finally agreed to show her the last video of her husband. A technician escorted her to a dim surveillance room where monitors showed flickering grayscale images of snow-covered barracks and empty yards. "This is the last time he was seen," the technician muttered, though his voice trembled like he wished he hadn't said anything at all. The footage was time-stamped 2/17A. Viktor stepped out of the barracks door alone, fully uniformed, hat on, boots laced, but no coat. Outside, the temperature hovered at 34 degrees Celsius. The cold should have knocked the breath out of him instantly, but he didn't even flinch. He closed the door as quietly as if trying not to wake anyone inside. Then he just stood there, not moving, not shivering. His breath should have steamed in the air, but the camera resolution was too poor to tell. After a few seconds, he tilted his head not sharply, not violently, but the slow, deliberate turn of a man listening to someone standing just behind him. Only there was no one there, no shadows, no footprints, no disturbances in the snow. He took one step forward, then another, until he crossed the small courtyard and reached the line where the floodlights faded into the darkness of the tree line. He didn't look back, not once. At the edge of the forest he paused again, as if whoever he thought he heard was now speaking directly to him. And then, without hesitation or visible fear, Viktor walked into the black mouth of the Siberian forest and disappeared from the camera's view forever. Elena clenched the table so hard her knuckles turned white. "Did anyone follow him?" she asked. The technician swallowed. "Yes. A patrol went out within minutes. They found nothing. No prints, no tracks, no sign he ever walked there." "But you saw him," Elena said. "You watched him walk," The technician nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the frozen screen. "Ma'am, we've watched that footage over 100 times, and every time we ask ourselves the same question." Elena waited. "If he walked into that forest," the technician whispered, "why didn't the snow remember him?" By dawn, the outpost exploded into motion. Snowmobiles roared to life, soldiers scrambled into formation, and Siberia, usually silent and unmoved, echoed with the frantic urgency of men who knew time was already slipping away. Elite trackers from the ministry's Special Reconnaissance Division arrived within hours, men trained to follow footprints across frozen rivers and through storms so brutal they could peel skin from bone. But even they weren't prepared for what they found, or rather, what they didn't. The first team reached the tree line where Victor had vanished and expected to see at least a faint trail, a depression, anything. Instead, the snow lay untouched. Perfect, pristine, as if the forest had reset itself during the night. "He walked right here," the sergeant insisted, pointing at the exact line where Victor had stepped off camera. But the trackers exchanged uneasy glances. They knew untouched snow when they saw it. They swept the area with thermal drones, hoping to catch any lingering signature. A warm body, a discarded object, or even the fading heat imprint of something recently alive. The screens returned nothing but the endless purple-black void of cold wilderness. No animals, no fires, no human trace. Dogs were brought in next, massive Caucasian shepherds trained to follow scents over kilometers of rugged terrain. The animals jerked forward eagerly at first, noses low, tails stiff. Then, abruptly, they all stopped. Every one of them. They circled once, whined, and sat down, refusing to move another inch. Handlers tried again and again. Same result. The scent vanished less than 30 meters from the barracks door. "That's impossible," one handler muttered. But impossibility was becoming the theme. By the third day, soldiers were stumbling through waist-deep snow, frostbite creeping up fingers and ears, tempers flaring. A lieutenant broke down screaming that no man could vanish like that unless he was taken. Others whispered about wolves, spirits, classified technology, anything that made more sense than footprints that ended mid-stride. By the fourth day, officials from Moscow arrived not with reinforcements, but with termination orders. The search was to be shut down immediately. No explanation, no press, no more questions. Soldiers protested. Officers protested. Elena begged. But the operation ended as abruptly as it had begun. Vehicles were recalled, equipment packed, files locked away. In a matter of hours, the outpost returned to its eerie silence, and Viktor Sokolov remained exactly where he had been since the night he walked into the forest nowhere. When the official search collapsed, the unofficial one began. Soldiers clustered in doorways, around mess hall tables, in dimly lit barracks where frost coated the windows and conversations felt dangerous even in whispers. Viktor Sokolov wasn't just a commander, he was respected, almost to the point of myth. And men like that didn't vanish without a story forming in the void they left behind. The first rumor came from a young corporal who swore Victor had been acting off for weeks. Not erratic, not unstable, just distracted, as if listening to conversations no one else could hear. He'd stop mid-sentence, craning his neck toward the door. He'd walk the perimeter alone at night, long after inspections were over, pausing in the same spot behind the barracks where the floodlights didn't reach. A sergeant claimed Victor complained more than once about someone outside at night, footsteps circling the barracks long after the soldiers had turned in. But when guards checked, they found nothing. No tracks, no shadows, no intruders. Others said Victor had requested a transfer out of Sever 1-2, something almost unheard of for a man who had spent half his career in frozen borderlands without complaint. The request was denied, no reason given, no follow-up allowed. One soldier believed Victor had been targeted, that someone inside the ranks wanted him gone. Another swore Victor had snapped under pressure, driven mad by isolation and cold and responsibility. But none of those theories held up to anyone who actually knew the man. Victor was steady, rational, the one you trusted when everything else was falling apart. Elena heard every rumor, every contradiction, every half-whispered confession spoken by men too afraid to put their names on anything official, and she rejected them all. Her husband didn't hallucinate. He didn't break. He didn't run. Something had happened to him, something deliberate, something powerful enough to erase footprints, silence dogs, and send trained soldiers retreating back to base with fear in their eyes. Something no one wanted to admit could exist, and somewhere in the frozen dark, beyond the outpost's lights, that something was still waiting. Elena Sokolova wasn't the type to accept silence, not from the ministry, not from officers who hid behind clipped language, and certainly not from a disappearance that made no logical sense. When officials shut down the search, she didn't go home. She packed a duffel bag, grabbed Victor's old field journal for strength, and headed straight into the same unforgiving territory that had swallowed her husband whole. The trip to Sever 1-2's region wasn't easy. It took 3 flights, a half-day in a military cargo truck, and finally a rickety snowmobile ride operated by a civilian who wouldn't stop crossing himself every time she mentioned Victor's name. "Strange things happen here," he muttered, "things the government cannot explain." But Elena had stopped fearing strange things. She feared forgetting. Her investigation began with the people who knew the land better than any ministry official ever would: hunters, trappers, reindeer herders, border guards stationed in lonely outposts with more wolves than humans for company. They were the kind of people who didn't waste words. But when she showed them Victor's photo, something flickered behind their eyes. Recognition, hesitation, unease. A trapper living near the taiga edge told her he'd seen a tall man walking the ridgeline months after Victor vanished. A border guard claimed he spotted someone matching Victor's description collecting firewood at dusk. A hunter insisted he once saw smoke rising from a part of the forest that wasn't on any of his maps. Every sighting had the same tone: quiet, uncertain, but undeniably real. Yet each person added one more detail, a detail that made Elena's stomach twist. "He wasn't alone," the trapper whispered. "There was someone with him." "A woman," the hunter added. "She moved strangely, like she wasn't used to walking on snow." "I thought it was a ghost," another said with a nervous laugh. "Or worse." When Elena pressed for specifics who this woman was, where she came from, no one had answers. Some said she wore old-fashioned clothing. Some said her hair was long and tangled. Others said her face was always turned away, as if deliberately hiding. But one thing every witness agreed on: Victor was living deep in the forest, and he wasn't living there by choice. Elena left each interview with more questions than answers, but also with a growing, chilling certainty. Her husband hadn't vanished. He had been taken into the forest by someone no one could describe. Someone who should not have been there at all. For nearly 2 years the trail stayed frozen, colder than the Siberian earth that had guarded its secrets since the night Victor stepped into the woods. Elena returned home only when exhaustion forced her to. The ministry refused to reopen the case. Surveillance drones showed nothing. Local sightings slowed. Winter after winter rolled through, burying every clue beneath meters of ice and silence. And then, in February 2025, everything changed. A private logging company scanning terrain near the Mongolian border sent an anomaly report to regional authorities. On satellite images, a rectangular structure appeared deep in the forest. Not a ruin, not debris, a building, a cabin that hadn't existed in aerial photos from the months or even years prior. Even more disturbing, a thin spiral of smoke rose from its chimney every evening just before nightfall, like clockwork. The coordinates were nowhere near any legal settlement, military post, or known shelter. The region was supposed to be empty, untouched, the kind of place where no sane person lived through winter unless they were running from something or hiding something. The company forwarded the images to the Ministry of Natural Resources, which quietly forwarded them to the Ministry of Defense. Within hours, denial stamped every page. No operations in the area. No authorized personnel present. Structure likely misidentified terrain shadow. Elena didn't buy a word of it. She'd spent 2 years memorizing this region's satellite grids, weather patterns, and forestry maps. She recognized the coordinates instantly. They fell just north of an uncharted valley, where several locals claimed they had seen Victor walking with the mysterious woman. She didn't hesitate. That night she packed her gear, left a note for her sister, and boarded the first train heading east. By the time she reached the taiga again, the air was sharp enough to crystallize her eyelashes, and the world felt hollow, waiting. Everyone, she asked rangers, loggers, border guards, had heard about the cabin but refused to approach it. "Someone is living there," one logger said, his voice low. "But it's not a place for normal people. Not anymore." Elena tightened her scarf, checked the coordinates, and stared into the endless white forest. If Victor was alive, this was where he would be. And if he wasn't, she was going to find out why the cabin burned its smoke every night, like a signal meant for someone who wasn't supposed to return. The last stretch of Elena's journey felt less like travel and more like descent into silence, into isolation, into a part of the forest that seemed to absorb sound instead of echo it. The coordinates led her across frozen riverbeds, through narrow ravines where the wind howled like something wounded, and along ridgelines where the snow reached her knees and fought every step she took. Hours bled into a white blur. Her breath burned in her throat. Her eyelashes froze together. By the time the cabin finally appeared through the trees, she almost didn't believe it was real. It sat in a clearing so quiet it felt staged. A squat wooden structure with a steep roof, old but not abandoned. Its walls were clean, its windows unbroken. A thin ribbon of smoke curled lazily from the chimney, steady, warm, alive. But the snow around it, that was wrong. It was flawless. No footprints, no paths, no tracks of any sort. Fresh snowfall couldn't explain it. The drifts were undisturbed except for the faint fall of ash drifting from the chimney. Someone was inside, someone warm, someone cooking. And yet no one had come or gone in days, maybe weeks. Elena's heartbeat hammered in her ears. She approached slowly, boots crunching loudly in a world that didn't seem to want noise. She knocked once. The sound echoed unnaturally, as if the cabin were hollow or listening. No answer. She knocked again, harder. Still nothing. She felt a prickle along her neck. The forest was too still, too attentive. She tried the door. It didn't budge, locked from the inside. "Victor?" she called, her voice cracking in the frigid air. Nothing. No footsteps. No shifting shadows. No movement. Just the wind brushing the eaves and the steady exhale of smoke rising into the darkening sky. Something inside was alive. Something inside was waiting. Elena stepped back, took a breath so sharp it stabbed her lungs, and rammed her shoulder against the door. Once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th hit the wood gave way with a splintering crack. The door swung inward. And the warmth that drifted out felt wrong, too calm, too deliberate, like the cabin had been expecting her. The first thing Elena noticed wasn't the smell of burning wood or the oppressive heat compared to the frozen world outside. It was the stillness. The kind of stillness that felt planned, curated, like a stage set after the actors have stepped away. The cabin interior was small but immaculate. Meticulously organized shelves lined the walls, holding canned food arranged by date, lanterns polished to a shine, blankets folded with military precision. Whoever lived here valued order or obsession. Then she saw the maps. Dozens of them pinned to the walls with small metal tacks, their corners curling slightly from the warmth inside. Old Soviet military charts, modern satellite prints, hand-sketched diagrams, all marked with strange circles, concentric rings, spirals, pathways leading nowhere. Some circled locations she recognized from her search. Others marked places even the locals feared. Candles sat burned down to stubs on every flat surface, wax hardened into pale rivers. A lantern flickered on a crate. A kettle hissed softly on the stove, as if it had only just begun to boil, but it was the table that stole her breath. At the center of the room sat a small wooden dining table, perfectly set, 2 plates, 2 cups, 2 sets of utensils, positioned with obsessive symmetry. One plate held food that was still warm, steam curling faintly from the surface. Buckwheat, black bread, a slice of something salted, fresh, recently cooked. The second plate was untouched, clean, waiting. Elena felt her stomach twist. Someone had been eating here minutes ago, someone expecting company. Her eyes scanned the corners, the shadows under the bed, the small pantry door slightly ajar. Nothing moved, nothing breathed. She dared a step forward and touch the chair beside the untouched plate. It was warm, recently occupied. She turned slowly, every instinct screaming that she was not alone, that whoever set that table was nearby, just beyond sight, maybe watching her from between the trees, or from some hidden corner of the cabin she hadn't yet found. And yet the only sound was the soft whistle of the kettle and the steady thump of her own pulse. "Victor," she whispered, though a part of her prayed he wouldn't answer, because whatever lived in this cabin had prepared dinner for 2. Elena moved toward the table, scanning for a sign, any sign that Victor had been here moments before. A glint of something beneath the dining rug caught her eye, just barely visible where the corner had curled upward. She pulled the rug back and revealed a metal ring embedded in the floorboards. A trapdoor. The boards around it were scuffed, worn from frequent use. Someone had opened it many, many times. Her breath hitched. She gripped the ring and pulled. The hinges groaned, exhaling a breath of cold, stale air from the darkness below. A narrow ladder descended into a small cellar lit by a single flickering bulb. Shelves lined with canned food. A cot. A bucket of melted snow water. A coat she recognized instantly. Victor's winter coat, the one he wore the night he vanished. And in the far corner, hunched against the wall like a man carved from shadow, was Victor, alive, bearded, thin to the bone. He stared at her with eyes that belonged to someone who had spent years listening to something he didn't want to hear. He didn't blink, didn't move. He just stared like she was a memory, not a person. "Victor," she whispered, trembling. For a long moment he didn't react. Then his lips parted and a hoarse whisper escaped, brittle as cracked ice. "You shouldn't have come." His voice was so faint she had to lean closer to hear. "I told her you wouldn't." The cellar seemed to tilt. Elena's pulse pounded in her ears. "Told who?" Victor flinched at the question, as if the answer itself were a wound. He shook his head slowly, eyes darting to the top of the ladder, toward the main room above them. "She's going to be angry," he whispered. "She doesn't like surprises." The way he said she made Elena's skin crawl. She swallowed hard, fighting the urge to look over her shoulder even though they were underground. "Victor, who is she?" But he pressed himself tighter into the wall, the tendons in his neck standing out like wires. "No more, please. We have to go before she knows you're here." That was when Elena realized something that chilled her blood more than the frozen world outside. Victor's fear wasn't of the forest. It wasn't of being found. It was of someone else in that cabin, someone who wasn't there now, but had been. They didn't stay long. The moment Elena got Victor up the ladder and out of the cabin, she activated the emergency beacon she'd carried for months, a last resort she'd prayed she'd never have to use. Within hours, soldiers from a border regiment descended on the clearing, surrounding the cabin in a silent ring of rifles and frozen breath. They escorted Victor and Elena away on snowmobiles, engines roaring against the night, drowning out whatever might have been listening. Only once they were miles from the cabin, once the treetops stopped leaning inward like eavesdroppers, did Victor begin to speak. His words stumbled out of him in broken pieces, as if he had buried the language along with his past. "I didn't. "Walk out there alone," he murmured, staring straight ahead. "I wasn't supposed to." Elena sat beside him in the transport vehicle, clutching his trembling hand. "Then who was with you?" Victor's eyes clouded. "I was invited." The soldiers exchanged uneasy looks. Elena squeezed his fingers. "Invited by who?" "A woman," he said, the word barely audible. "She was living in the forest." Deep. Too deep. He swallowed hard, as if the memory itself tasted wrong. "I didn't know her. I had never seen her before that night." The cabin rattled as the vehicle hit a ridge of ice, but Victor didn't react. "She knew things," he continued. "Things she shouldn't know. Things about me, about the outpost, about you." Elena felt the blood drain from her face. "What kinds of things?" "Everything," he whispered. "She knew everything." He rubbed his temples, wincing as if the memories pressed inward like cold hands. "She found me when I was on patrol. She said my name before I ever told her. She said she had been waiting." Elena's voice trembled. "For what?" Victor finally looked at her then, and the hollow emptiness in his eyes was worse than any wound. "For me." The silence inside the vehicle thickened. Even the soldiers stopped pretending not to listen. Victor leaned his head back against the metal wall, eyes drifting shut as if he were slipping into another world entirely. "She saved my life," he said softly. "When the cold should have killed me, when the forest should have buried me." His breath shuddered. "But she wouldn't let me leave, ever. Not until I convinced her you'd never come looking." Elena's grip tightened around his hand. "But I did." Victor nodded, a hollow, defeated motion. "And now, she won't stop." The vehicle sped on through the frozen dark, but Elena felt something colder than Siberia sink into her bones. Whatever had kept Victor alive out there wasn't done with them, not even close. By the time Victor and Elena were stabilized at a regional military facility, the ministry had already formed a recovery team, dozens of armed men, thermal drones, a mobile command unit flown in under the pretense of a border security inspection. None of them said it aloud, but every soldier felt it. Whatever Elena had dragged out of the forest wasn't just a missing commander. It was a warning. At dawn, a convoy set out toward the coordinates of the cabin. Elena wasn't allowed to go. Victor wasn't capable of going. The soldiers left with nervous jokes and tight jaws. They returned silent. The commander of the operation called Elena into a briefing room, closed the blinds, and laid a stack of photographs on the table. She didn't understand at first. The clearing was there. The trees, the snow, the exact same terrain she had walked through only days before. But the cabin wasn't. There was no structure, no walls, no roof, no chimney. No door she had broken through with her shoulder. No trapdoor leading to a cellar. Nothing. Just a smoothed-over patch of snow where the building should have stood, as if something had pressed down from above and erased it clean. Not even the outline of a foundation remained. The snow was perfectly flat, untouched by boot prints or animal tracks. "Where are the maps?" she asked. "Gone," the commander replied. "The table? The dishes? The candles? Gone. All of it." "The cellar?" He paused, jaw tightening. "There is no cellar." Elena shook her head. "That's impossible. I opened it." I climbed down. "Ma'am?" the commander said quietly. "Our engineers scanned the soil. It's undisturbed. No one has dug there in years." Elena stared at the photos, her pulse hammering in her ears. She knew what she had seen. She knew where she had found Victor. And yet the cabin had vanished overnight, erased so completely it might never have existed at all. One soldier finally spoke up, voice cracking slightly. "We found one thing," he said, "deep in the tree line." He slid an evidence bag across the table. Inside was a small scrap of fabric, deep blue, frayed along one edge. Not military issue, not local, and not Elena's. She pressed trembling fingers to the plastic but didn't open it. The commander cleared his throat. "Mrs. Sokolova, Whoever else was out there, we didn't find them. Elena looked at the empty clearing on the photograph and felt a cold, deeper than Siberia, settle into her bones. Because she knew whoever had lived with Victor for 2 years didn't simply walk away. She disappeared like the cabin, deliberately, silently, completely. For 3 weeks, Victor barely spoke. He drifted in and out of focus, sometimes lucid, sometimes staring at corners as if listening to whispers no one else could hear. Doctors blamed trauma. Psychologists blamed isolation. Elena blamed none of them. She blamed the forest. On the 21st morning, while helping Victor dress for another evaluation, she felt something stiff inside the lining of his coat, something that hadn't been there before. She reached into the pocket and pulled out a folded piece of thick paper. Not military stationery, not hospital-issued, handmade, cold. She unfolded it slowly, her breath catching when she saw the handwriting delicate, looping, immaculate. Not hers, not Victor's, 4 words: he was never alone. The floor seemed to tilt under her feet, her hands shook. Something else slipped from the coat and fluttered to the ground, a photograph. She picked it up with numb fingers. It showed the cabin interior exactly as she remembered it. The table set neatly for 2, candles burned low, steam curling from a fresh plate of food. But this time the vantage point was different, as if someone had taken the picture from the far wall, hidden in shadow, someone watching, someone waiting. The worst part wasn't the angle. It was the fact that Victor was in the photo, sitting at the table, leaning forward slightly like he was listening to someone just out of frame. Elena swallowed hard and looked at him. "Victor, did you take this?" He shook his head immediately, violently. No, I never, Elena. I never had a camera." "Then who?" He covered his face with his hands, shoulders trembling. "She liked to leave things," he whispered. "Little reminders, so I wouldn't forget she was there." Elena looked back at the photograph. The second person at the table was visible only as a silhouette, head turned away, hair falling over one shoulder. But the shape of her body, the slope of her shoulders, the familiar tilt of her head, it looked almost impossibly like Elena. Not exactly, not quite, but close enough to make her stomach twist in on itself, close enough to feel intentional. "This isn't real," Elena whispered, but Victor only stared at the wall, eyes hollow. "She knew you would find me," he said. "She knew the whole time." Elena folded the note, placed it in her palm, and felt the weight of it settle like a stone. Someone or something had lived with Victor for 2 years in that cabin. Someone who moved through snow without leaving tracks. Someone who disappeared without leaving a trace. Someone who knew Elena's face well enough to imitate it. And whoever she wasn't finished. This story was brutal, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.